Hello, this is Christopher Small, and you're listening to the Outskirts Film Podcast. Today, I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Hello, I'm Öykü Sofoğlu, and I'm really happy to be here.
I'm Alonso Aguilar, and also part of the Outskirts Film Podcast crew, I guess, and also happy to be here.
This is a podcast about cult cinema, experimental film, popular cinema, and everything in between. Some weeks we'll tackle individual filmmakers or periods of film history, and others still we'll devote to long conversations with individual directors. This first week we're going to tackle a strange and rather beguiling artist who maybe straddles these two worlds in his own way. That is Polish-French filmmaker Walerian Borowczyk, aka Boro. How did you both first come to Borowczyk's films? Was there a memorable first interaction, or how did you first hear about him?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the name of Borowczyk originally appeared to me when, just like when you're having that juvenile impulse to look for like fucked up films and this kind of like the forbidden door of films and those kind of things that only sickos watch, and then you immediately come across like Immoral Tales and The Beast, which are kind of like in dialogue with each other. So to me, initially, like Borowczyk had this kind of like, I don't know if like reputation as a filmmaker, but just like for me, he was like the Beast guy, the guy that did like the prosthetic hairy dicks and the ejaculating sequences and like those kind of like very lowbrow. Yeah, sorry about that. Kind of like lowbrow impulses. So it's kind of interesting to see, and I guess we'll get into that later, about how much that tension between the lowbrow and the highbrow, to me at least, kind of like articulate his work.
I mean, I think like even before like deciding on this figure, I would always consider Borowczyk as a like someone I know from afar, but never was interested in exploring his work. And maybe I don't know if I'm like a minority in that sense, but I feel like his work is always like in between different styles of different authors, and it's never easy to classify his work. And that's why I think he's really intriguing from the perspective of a cinephile, because you can't create and found a lineage.
In a way, to me, it's always been between like these two different kinds of cult figures. Like he's not fully into like the Jess Franco, like Joe D'Amato kind of like sicko, like cinephile kind of like grindhouse shtick, but also he's not also with like perhaps the more like highbrow, like surreal, like I don't know, like more art house approved, like Pasolini or like Buñuelian, like kind of provocations.
Pardonnez-moi, en réalité je pensais que je pouvais le faire, mais je sors immédiatement si je vous déplais. On m'appelle Boro.
Walerian Borowczyk was born in 1923 near Poznan in Poland. He was, from a young age, very interested in kind of painting, lithography, visual arts. Living in Poznan and growing up, he was kind of adjacent to a lot of Nazi horrors and was kind of in some way affected by that, although the extent to that is not so well documented. But later, particularly in his animations, you would see some of the traces of that. Existing in Poland in that time, obviously, was a little bit circumscribed by the state. But actually, Borowczyk's emigration to France was something that happened not because of state repression against his work, but actually through the fact that he made some first animations with Jan Lenica, another filmmaker, and took those animations to the Expo 58 in Brussels, found a kind of acclaim there that was really intoxicating, and from there sort of flowed to Paris. That period of intense work with animations and intense acclaim for those same animations. A lot can be spoken about that time. As we were researching this podcast, we found some very interesting anecdotes where he was hugged at a Paris retrospective of his animations by André Breton when he presented his first animated feature, which was this kind of anti-Disney film, The Theatre of Mr. and Mrs. Cabal. Weirdly, John Ford was at a dinner after the film was presented, and he stood up and he congratulated him for doing what we all want to do, which is make a commercial movie without surrendering your personality. And I was saying before we were recording that Öykü, you live in France. and the country that Borowczyk spent almost his whole life working in. And there, I mean, it's very common when you read texts about his work that he's referred to as Boro.
I think he also indulges himself in a lot of like self-mythologizing in his later life through his writings and biography. So I think Boro, that like name itself, also is kind of constitutes a starting point of that process. And in that sense, I think it's interesting that like he's even the first animated feature, Mr. Cabal, apparently is supposed to be an autobiographical film about his and his wife's relationship. But I just want to go back to this John Ford or Breton praising this film, but I can see why, because I think he was compared to Eisenstein a lot, like while we were reading it. I also like noticed that, and
which is pretty crazy,
yeah. But at the same time, he's like Eisenstein was also interested in Disney, so I think there are some like affinities between his path maybe as a filmmaker, then not necessarily as like interests and themes, but maybe more visual affinities with him. That's also interesting.
I think an interesting thing to think about with Borowczyk is that idea of like entering these films expecting a certain kind of cult movie, and just because of course, you know, you can say it outright that porn and erotica and sexuality is like huge in these movies. I mean, in the earlier movies in a more kind of subdued, under the surface way, and then later like literally explosively at times. In my case, like I oscillate between, with Borowczyk, sometimes within the same film, finding them both like deeply engrossing and deeply strange, and also quite boring. And that kind of like, what the hell is that attitude? Like I have it sometimes, and I imagine someone who's, you know, 18 watching the first half of The Beast, and it's just like this sort of, you know, it looks like a 70s Revette film. It's just like shot in this presumably rented villa. Everyone's in costumes, walking around slowly. It's like slow panning camera. Like, you know, there's that element to Borowczyk as well.
We also like see and read that he had so many projects that he didn't at the end manage to make. So I feel like it's more about like more financial or maybe material circumstances that lead him to make a film than like being motivated or like totally obsessed with an idea. So it was just like, I don't know, maybe I'm just speculating right now, but that kind of having a distance vis-a-vis a project is also interesting. Like maybe he was just like, I think there's a comment of him saying like, these films are done in an instant, so it's just more like a impulse than a project that you build and build. So I think when you make something on an impulse, obviously you'll have some like ups and downs or more like inconsistencies, and if you embrace that style, I think you're on the right.
Là-bas, ce n'est pas mieux, c'est différent. Nous ne vivrons pas plus vieux, mais ensemble.
Cela veut dire plus longtemps.
Pour toujours.
Tu es sûr de tes soldats?
Ils pensent qu'il s'agit d'une promenade. Même s'ils savaient tout, ils ne nous trahiraient pas.
Même si le gouverneur leur donne davantage de tabac?
The Theatre of Mr. and Mrs. Cabal, I mean, it's not exactly my cup of tea. It's not a film that I really can tune into the wavelengths of. Whereas his first feature film, live action film, Goto Island of Love, it's not exactly I'm not exactly on its wavelengths, because it's this sort of like near abstract, sort of prosaic, highly symbolic in some way drama about an island ruled by a totalitarian king who is completely disconnected from his people. But it really shows to me that like when Borowczyk moved towards live action away from animation, he kept this like highly aestheticized, this interest in aestheticization, in things being, you know, very sort of ornate, precise, like every detail. And that film is interesting too, because almost I think the whole film was shot in a warehouse in May 1968. And apparently, they built this warehouse, they built these sets, and you see it in the film. There's almost this kind of like dead-on shots of people moving through very abstracted space. It's supposed to be this island. And May 68 was kind of almost literally knocking at the door. Outside, there were huge protests, and Borowczyk apparently was just completely uninterested in that and very cynical about it. But like when that to me, like even though this is not exactly my kind of film, that's what I see as the blood that runs through the veins of all of his films. It's this kind of like strange, like he's drawn to like often very over the top sexuality at the same time as he's drawn to like really minute details and this like ornate quality of everything and a very sort of prosaic quality to the scene.
Actually, that was kind of my experience watching Blanch. It was perhaps the first like non-cult Borowczyk that I watched. That perhaps like spoiled a little bit of the experience for me. Even in Immoral Tales, there's some of them that kind of verge almost in this looking like just as a Monteiro film, like this like very ornate and lyrical like kind of like explorations. And Blanch almost has that for like the whole way through in a way. I think it kind of introduces like this idea of like lust and desire, but still very like tenuous at least. And in my experience, that was one of the films which definitely leaned more towards like just outright, I wouldn't say like boring per se, but just like it's like on a degree of respectability that to me is not really that interesting. Particularly, perhaps in general, but specifically with him, like knowing what kind of things he eventually will start like doing in his films, kind of to subvert or perhaps to create those kind of like juxtapositions, which are perhaps where the most interest comes to me. So yeah, Blanch for me is kind of an interesting example of seeing like that progression, and perhaps one of the most like outright examples of what like a purely like auteurist Borowczyk career might have looked like.
But it's also interesting because both those films, Goto and Blanch, is, I think, conceptually related to one another because I think they take place, like narratively take place in the same island. Correct me if I'm wrong. But even in the, I think, formal choices, it's a period where he's still thinking of more like two-dimensional surfaces. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I feel like it's more about like a visual than cinematographic ideas. You know what I mean? Like it's more about like iconography of Christianity and Middle Ages. His images are mostly about like two-dimensional figures moving in a relatively limited space and not necessarily with the depth of field doesn't play that much role. Maybe, I don't know. This is my impression, at least compared to his later films. And maybe this is the only part where we can create a more chronological approach to his films. And later, I think it becomes the beast is finally free and it roams more freely in his filmography. But I think, as you both said aptly, there's the surface level, and somehow there's a moment or like a turning point that kind of clicks, and that's where we see more like a out of control impulses and desires, lust come to surface and roam freely.
Those, as Alonso said, those two films, like they present this like possible other trajectory of Borowczyk, as if I'm very much interested in his personality because he seems like really he was a monster in many ways. Those two films seem to me like this weirdly pure version of this intense control that he had on the set. Like everything is a kind of picture box. You can fix every detail. The interesting thing about the guy, I think, from reading about his life is that he was like deeply contradictory in many ways. His films are well known for being sort of blasphemous in many ways against the Catholic Church, but he himself claimed that he was like a deeply romantic Catholic, and at some point in his career was really obsessed about, tormented by the idea that Pope John Paul II would find his films sacrilegious. But as his career sort of fell apart, he quit filmmaking quite dramatically, I would say. I mean, at some point he was making some small shorts and documentaries, but by the end of the 80s and the start of the 90s, he stopped making films. And for the next 15, 16, 17 years, he just wrote, attacked his critics very vocally in newspapers. He wrote many books about how he was misunderstood. Even and maybe especially the Borowczyk films that I love the most are the films where that control kind of eludes him in some way. That like the films have a kind of messiness and a spontaneity that doesn't really jibe so well with like the guy who made Goto, Island of Love.
Especially when you read like these more biographical aspects of these films and you say like, oh, I like this thing, and you learn that it's not something he wanted, but mostly like imposed by the studio or something. Like, I don't have any particular example, but upon reading that, you find so many details like that about films. Like, you say, oh, this is a great idea, and actually he wanted something else, but he was just like, the producer wasn't okay with that, and he just made it that way. Like, he himself wasn't happy with these films, even though we like it, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. It's kind of like the reverse version of someone like Jacques Tourneur, for example, which he has like all this like expressiveness in his films, and he's like, oh no, I'm not an artist. Well, like Borowczyk seems like to be like this suppressed artist, and always trying to like get his art out there, but just like the system kind of like framing him as, no, you're just like pornographer, and actually that's perhaps what's so interesting about his work. I was going to mention briefly, there's like one short before he did like Immoral Tales called Une collection particulière, which I think is just like him showing...
nice French accent.
Please don't start. where he's just like showing he just happened to have like a collection of vintage erotica. And I think you can really see how that short film really like starts like a new trajectory in his career, and I think that was supposed to be also within like Immoral Tales as one of the perhaps the introduction, and then was left out. But yeah, you can just like see that short film, and afterwards immediately it's just like Immoral Tales, The Beast, Story Scene. So yeah, I was also kind of intrigued to see like how almost like deliberate and like meditated decision it seemed to be, like perhaps not by his own impulse, but just like the natural flow of like what people will start like associating him with.
I haven't actually seen Immoral Tales, which is kind of interesting because I think if you look on Letterboxd, it's his most well-known film. But I found it interesting as an example of a guy who comes from Poland to France. I mean, that's another aspect of his personality, is that he was deeply, for the rest of his life, deeply obsessed with what people in Poland thought of him, and was constantly writing about, the intellectual poverty of Polish cinema, Polish writing, and so on, but also completely consumed by it. But this is a guy who comes as an immigrant to France and makes his life in France, and spent a lot of his time, attacking his peers in some way. And I know that Immoral Tales was actually a kind of explicit riposte to Eric Romer and the Moral Tales.
That's one part, but I think there's like two ways, because when you become an immigrant, you either like reject your country and totally like adapt the codes, the culture of your like welcoming country, and in this case he's not like you can't fit him to this Polish cinema that is like filmmakers tormented by the regime. Like, you can't, he doesn't fit there. So what does he have? He has to get into French film culture, but he's not there either. So it's also this frustration from a perspective of more like a cinephile to like situate him, because he doesn't belong there either. Even I think when you say Godard or Romer, I think like The Beast was competing with Emmanuel. Like, even there, like in the box office, his rival is not those guys, it's Emmanuel's film director. So even there, I think he's not in the Premier League, let's say.
Yeah, I think even perhaps someone that one might say has like, I wouldn't say like a particularly like similar career path, but someone like Paul Becchiali that just starts doing like, again, this kind of like interpolations of like pornographic film, and then has an actual art house reputation at some point. Like Borowczyk never really gets there, and it's interesting also to think about Immoral Tales, I think, because it's funny to hear about how he didn't want to offend the Pope, and then you have like literally the Pope figure in the last part of Immoral. Oh, I guess it's a spoiler, but there's incest in Immoral Tales, as you probably could expect, involving the Pope in one of the sequences. I think it also starts kind of like this tendency in his work to start dealing with this kind of like the mythology around these historical European figures, which to me is kind of interesting as well. I know he kind of goes to that I haven't seen these films, but by the final stretch of his career, he does like two, which just by seeing them, they look like deeply orientalistic, orientalistic short films. One in Iraq and one in China, and both are doing like around the figures of like seductresses of history.
Well, I mean, you've seen Emmanuel 5, so you know you know the racism that's waiting at the door.
But there's a contradictory aspect to that, because like when you read what he says about this erotica and pornographic aspect, I feel like his comments are always like, I was like forced to add sex scenes, as if he doesn't want that.
Very Catholic of him.
But like that's so funny. Like
someone forced me to do it.
Yeah, I like for instance the scene, masturbation scene in Behind in the Convent Walls. Apparently, that's the producer who wanted to put that scene in the film. So when
it's one of the best scenes in the film.
See, that's what I was talking about. Like when you think about what he wanted and what the film has become is different, and that's the beauty of it, I think.
It's not a slight to say that he exists because of, you know, pressures from the market or pressures from producers, but actually the fact that he exists in the way he does is what's interesting. Like when he was defending the Immoral Tales, he basically talked about erotica and eroticism in very moral terms. I can quote exactly. He said, "Eroticism does not kill, does not annihilate, does not lead one to evil, and does not enable crime." So, you know, no matter where he was going, no matter where his impulses were taking him, he was always looking at things in this kind of like theological, mystical, grand, moralizing way.
Well, I always associate him with like the visual equivalent of libertine literature, and also that thing you were mentioning just about like finding this kind of weirdly like moralistic, even like religious like framing of things. That was originally like the whole shtick of the libertines. Like, oh no, Calvinism isn't actually right because it's cool to have like adultery. You know, it's like we should like have that still. It shouldn't be a sin. We can make everything else a sin, but this specific thing we like shouldn't be a sin. So it's kind of like play around like the societal norms and like the what's permitted and not. Like I think that really shows in his like. I wouldn't say there's like this like authorist vein thematically, because clearly we've established there's like a lot came from like different like production practices and things like that, was still just like seeing like this constant retreat of like those ideas, and visually particularly in his films to me is quite interesting, particularly as he like starts getting into like the 80s.
Behind Convent Walls, which is a film that I know that Borowczyk was more personally invested in on the level of erotica, because he had a very coherent idea of what was like horniness in that context, which is to say like he really saw a profound connection between a Christian obsession with Jesus's body and sexuality. And so in that scene, in that film, the nuns who were kind of like ogling crucifix of Jesus, looking at his hips and looking at his thighs and masturbating, that feels like the true Borowczyk connection in some way, you know, like whereas in The Beast, which I love, there's like just this desire to sort of one up, whereas Behind Convent Walls is a much more sensual film in that sense, because he has a coherent idea of sexuality, I guess, Christian sexuality.
And also, but it's still a really heterosexual film, and that reading is also like a interesting aspect that can open up other levels of analysis. But also, there's a juvenile energy to it. It's like a boarding school vibes. Do you know what I mean? And when you see, maybe I don't want to say that he's infantilizing these characters, this woman, but that aspect adds a different layer.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, you know, Behind Convent Walls that's one of my favorites, and also there's the fact that it's about horny nuns is something that like can't be discounted. I made a note that it was shot by Luciano Tovoli, who was this like unbelievably prolific and successful cinematographer, shot Antonio Needs the Passenger. You know, he had this like huge career in France and Italy. And when I see that film, which is, I mean, I can imagine that despite everything I've just said, I'm sure that Borowczyk probably didn't see it as his kind of opus. Nonetheless, I really do see it as this, you know, this river into which two influences are flowing. Like one is this like childish view of sexuality in some way, or at least kind of juvenile, as you said, but also combined with this like reverence, this like love of the image in some way. And there's this amazing moment at the end when the Mother Superior is lying in wake inside the church, and the camera is all handheld as well. And it's sort of like circling her dead body, and they're just roses surrounding the coffin. And it's just like this just amazing aesthetic moment that to me like really crystallized this aesthete aspect of Borowczyk's personality. Like as if that was like the one moment that he wanted to film above all else. Like just this moment of absolute perfection. And it takes place in the middle of a masturbating nun movie, you know, like that's to me like the interesting contradiction of his work.
Do you find that quality in, for instance, Dr. Jekyll? Because I feel like it's also kind of have that atmospheric level, but in a different form, in a different style, or maybe different. The tone is like the brightness or juvenile energy that you mentioned is not there, but still, I think it's the same kind of connection or like amalgam of different things.
That's my favorite one, and that's the one that, you know, sometimes you have a film by a great director that goes above and beyond what you would even expect from them normally, and that's the one that for me like really synthesizes all of the Borrow elements perfectly, because it's really like this insane erotic nightmare, you know, and it like the Jekyll and Hyde's aspect to it is just this kind of clothesline for a very sort of strange mix of images, of like horrifying nightmare style images and like intensely erotic images. And I mean, it's just like it's such a special movie.
And I think the last scene when they go on, I think it's in a carriage. They take a carriage and they're like kissing each other, but at the same time we don't know if they're trying to kill each other. Like they're in like this trance-like state, and they're all over each other, and it's and there's this music, I think it's Bernard Parmigiani, and it's like you're totally engrossed by that moment, and you're like fascinated. And I was just stunned. There was nothing else while I was watching that scene. It was so impressive. And Udo Kier, rest in peace, the king, he's I think his facial features like is reminiscent of so many like great expressionist actors of 20s, like Conrad Veidt or Lon Chaney, like this really, I don't want to say grotesque, but this really characteristic specific face of male beauty. Like, I think he's really beautiful in that film, but in a grotesque way. And Borowczyk is someone we know of filming a lot of female bodies, like their beauty, their maybe like this, maybe at some point after watching one film after another, they become maybe less interesting, these bodies, but maybe more standardized in their thinness, in their perfect curves. But when you see him like framing Udo Kier's face and the transformation, there's also, I mean, maybe he can be as heterosexual as he wants, but there's a moment of fascination by a human face, a human body, I think.
I reclaim Borowczyk as a queer icon.
Well, Udo Kier was a queer icon, so, you know, he influences the film.
This one actually is also one of my favorites, perhaps my favorite, and I think it has to do with a change in register in a way. Like, to me, it almost feels, I think you were kind of alluding to the darkness of the film, in terms of like, feels almost like a 1960s gothic horror, like pre-Giallo kind of vibes. But again, like the plot doesn't really like flow in any like logical reason, so it's kind of like this like nightmare state that you're kind of like seeing. But also he has this like psychosexual element, which I also like kind of like associate with like late 60s like proto-Giallo films. But also, again, like Borowczyk's like sensibilities are like so present in this film. I mean, in the way of this like sexual tension and this like also sex as this like kind of like forbidden but liberating power in the film, which I think also kind of like it's the one like brings it all together to me. Perhaps because since he's dealing with like more like genre infused kind of like milieu in a way, to me just like let's like run rampant like over his perhaps more like focused attempts at like creating high art. I think in this film it kind of like just like goes out of his hands in a way, kind of like his ambitions. I can see them like start crumbling, and to me it's also kind of like a great thing to see in almost in real time within the film, particularly as it goes to as you were saying to like the climax of the film.
This is the film that we like the most, and later that's kind of like the downfall. Like,
what do you mean downfall?
More like of it.
Not for Alonso, I think.
Not for Alonso, who's the big, like, who champions Emmanuel 5 here. No, but like, let's say from the official history, what happens to Borowczyk's career?
I haven't seen this film, but there's like an interesting this film called Private Collections. I don't know if you saw this, which is kind of like a triptych kind of thing with Josh Jekyll of the first Emmanuel film and Shuji Terayama, better known I think for Fruits of Passion and those also kind of like films. So he was already kind of like, I guess, like aligned with this kind of like, oh, he's just one of these rigorously kind of erotic masters. But also, I think the fact you're kind of featuring one of these like triptych films or like anthology films kind of means you're perhaps out of your prime in a way. So it's interesting also to think about that. You're right.
I think also that those kind of 70s up to Dr. Jekyll, those films are very much like also the products of a very specific period in French cinema where censorship rules were relaxed. The distribution among cinemas was also relaxed, so pornographic films could show much more freely in regular cinemas and so on. So it was like a period of osmosis between these two worlds. It wasn't such strict divisions. Like as Alonso said, like Vecchiali is a good example of that in some way. In pornography and erotic cinema in general, like the 80s is known as this period of like downfall in some way. But it doesn't surprise me that in this period, that when Borowczyk was reaching for projects to make, that the kind of thing that he grabbed was Emmanuel 5. Where do we begin with this object?
So what brings you to Bangladesh?
A little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Sounds mysterious.
Not really. I do some trading, local craftsmanship, baskets, saris, necklaces, and I rescue women in my spare time. How about you? What's your deal, Emmanuel?
Nothing. I'm just visiting.
Don't stay long. This place has an unnatural hold on some people.
I think to me is almost his most autobiographical film.
Oh my god!
Because the whole film is based on like Emmanuel is kind of like defending the fact that she has doing pornography. Like the whole film is kind of this like moral witch hunt of this like doing like art house erotic films is like frowned upon. And then she goes to Cannes, this like weird like alternate universe version where they're showing what's the film called? Love Express. Alongside
amazing title.
Yeah, and also they're showing like Cobra, like the Stallone film.
Yeah. And also like you can very much see that a lot of the shots on the streets of Cannes were just stolen. You know.
Yeah. A way better version of Cannes, actually, if you think about it. To me, that film is very interesting to see like these kind of like savior figures around like Emmanuel, and I don't know, I can see like the projection almost on a psychoanalytical level of like Borowczyk like really empathizing with this like neglected figure that's trying to do her art at the same time. There's like a weird industry around her that doesn't really acknowledge what I mean, he basically did that after he went out of film when he was doing his books, like, oh, nobody really appreciated my work.
There's a mob in Cannes that follows her and she escapes, and she meets with this really rich she's naked. Like she runs naked and managed to get on a boat, which happens to be a boat by like of a millionaire. She starts to have a relationship with this extremely rich American guy, I think. And then, but there's this prince who invites her to Bangladesh, which is a country that doesn't exist. And then when she travels there and she's like confronted with this terrible, misogynistic rituals of the country and this terrible prince, basically. There you go. That's the plot.
I'm glad that this is the one plot we really made you explain.
Yeah, but then again, her savior from this like deeply Islamophobic kind of like plotline is again there's just like a white guy that's also disapproves of her erotic films. So he's like this constant in the film, so like not letting her be. There's also one sequence particularly in this film which kind of takes it back to me to I will say perhaps even like a better version of the masturbation scene in Behind Cone Walls, which is like, I don't know if you remember this, it's just like, kind of like Emmanuel is masturbating to like an image of like this like Middle Eastern ruler, and it's like crash zooms like of like the hair like stimulating her like intimate parts, and also like just like this figure like digital crash zooms like in and out, and I'm like, yeah, it's like pure Borowczyk. Like this is what he was building up for.
I think the film that you've both just described is much more coherent than the actual film. Especially, and it's actually interesting to go back to this connection you made with Eisenstein, because in a way this is the most Eisensteinian Borowczyk film in a way, because at some point I wish I loved this as much as Alonso does, but because at some point it just wears on me. But there is like this whole first 30 minutes of the film,
it's beautiful,
which is so good. I mean, and it's also so Borrow. I saw Love Rights right after seeing Emmanuel 5, and I was thinking, okay, Emmanuel 5 is this aberration, the auteur fell from grace, and let's go back to the nice, tidy French art house stuff. And what I was amazed to find is that, like, Love Rights is not that different to Emmanuel 5. That a lot of it is different on a surface level, but a lot of the very strange stylistic tics of Emmanuel 5 that while watching it I was attributing to producers meddling or just general insanity on Borowczyk's part are actually also present in Love Rights, which is to say, like, most obviously in Emmanuel, which by the way I think the version that we all saw had these like very crude hardcore inserts inserted into the film, which are very artless, and I'm not sure it's easy to defend or conceptualize those. But in the regular sex scenes in the film, you often don't see the characters' faces. In a way, it's like literally disembodied, because you're seeing bodies fucking, but you're hearing their dialogue over the image of them having sex without seeing their faces or mouths. Sometimes actually the camera will pan a little bit and you'll see their mouth is not moving. And this obviously just looks like a way of salvaging in post-production a big mess. But when you watch Love Rights, you see the same device again. That also in that, like, there's like the physical act of sex, but then there's also this like floating erotic language that is somehow disconnected with bodies. There's just like this strange like avant-garde density to that. And I'm watching that and I'm like, this is pure Borrow. There's no interference here.
But the funny thing, he also disowns this film. So I think it can be interesting to like make a more research about the production of this film, because he repeatedly says that like he only made 2 sequences of that film, and then he adds something. No, actually I shot 2 more because they gave me money so that I could buy a house in Italy. So I think he has this contradictory quotes about what parts of film he shot.
Yeah, and also Emmanuel 5, I know, had the US release was almost a totally different film that I think Roger Corman helped produce like some extra scenes that basically made it more of like a sex comedy. So perhaps that's which I will be interested in seeing that film as well. Because I think that the European version, like the European theatrical version, which isn't the one we saw, because it doesn't have like the random like hardcore inserts. I was reading that it was actually usually called the Borowczyk version. So like his pure vision for Emmanuel 5 was only seen in that like original theatrical release. So it's interesting to see like also the mythology with this specific film, which honestly, to see like it has 3 different versions, but at the same time it's one of the more like malign films even in this series. I
know I read somewhere someone referring to it as like the least reputable film by a major auteur ever, which I think is maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. I mean, if you've gone deep into the minds of some auteurs, but it's especially if you get a chance to see Love Rights. I mean, it's not a film that I'm crazy about, but it does both. When you put both films together, it does suggest a different direction that Borowczyk would have made at this period, because also you see that a lot with like the Nouvelle Vague filmmakers at this period. In the 80s, they started to transform into something else, and Love Rights in some way takes what's buried in Emmanuel 5 and starts to take it in a more kind of respectable direction to some extent, although the film is still full of sex and S&M and mind games. And Love Rights, it's basically about a pickup, that a guy picks up a woman on a metro and they spend the whole day fucking, and by the end she destroys him. But for a while it's like seems like a distant cousin of Eric Romer's The Aviator's Wife, for example.
I think the reason why we think like Borowczyk's the last period of his career is intriguing, because at those times filmmakers kind of start to like interact with younger generations, or like have a more like a lineage that will follow them, or like you kind of associate with them younger figures. But in his case, I think he at that point of his life had become more like a solitary figure, and that's why it becomes harder to just situate him in a more like a project him into the future of like you can't see this guy was really influenced by Borowczyk, or he put him under got him under his wings, and I don't know, that doesn't exist with him. Even Godard.
Well, there's Mandico.
But I don't think it's just like it's more like a one-sided thing. It's more like he is like unrequited love. So it's not like this he gave his like blessing or whatever. It's not like, I don't know, like this sense of community or like more kinship between artists.
It's interesting because the people who have taken up the sort of Borowczyk mantle, in as much as it exists, as you said, did it not necessarily in any kind of connection to the man himself, because, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, we've talked about everything up to 87. Then there was a few more years of producing things, which I don't think any of us have seen, but these kind of small TV documentaries. Then, he lived for another 15 years. And I think those 15, 16, 17 years, they were spent kind of alienating people on a very personal level. There was an interesting anecdote that after the fall of communism in 1992, in Poland, they finally showed some of his films that had been banned. They showed Immoral Tales and The Beast. And he personally said that he was expecting a kind of scandalous reaction, as you would imagine. And they were actually greeted with nonchalance, which I think, disturbed him on some level, because he imagined that those films would never stop shocking people. And then like for the next, however many years he was alive, I mean, there was a posthumous book he published called What Do I Think When I See a Polish Woman in the Nude, which was a memoir full of attacks against people who had criticized him, as well as like over-the-top obsessive descriptions of his wife. So I think like this like Borowczykian cohort who followed him didn't do so because they liked the man personally, or they worked alongside him.
So he was just like Orson Welles, is what you're saying.
I mean, when you think about certain parts of Other Side of the Wind, there is a Borowczykian quality to those films. So we thought, just to end here, maybe we could just give a few simple recommendations, one each, of something we've been watching lately. Maybe something with a Borowczyk flavor, if you can. What about you, Alonso?
Well, I haven't watched this recently, but like earlier this year I was revisiting the classic film Erotic Nights of the Living Dead by Joel D'Amato. which isn't one of the better regarded. If you see it and you see Emmanuel 5, I think there's like some kinship in what they're kind of doing. They're both perhaps deeply questionable films in racial and like ethnic regards, but at the same time, what they do with like montage and like the nonchalance of sex scenes, I think there's like almost like a psychotronic element to what's happening in both of them. And also this film by D'Amato, perhaps accidentally has like a weird like decolonial angle.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Surely accidental, I think.
or like foreign influence in like tropical Central American nations and how they literally sell the country. And then there's like this like undead thing that's also going on. So it's like a 3-part thing of like tropical horror, and a Black Emmanuel film. Actually, it's not part of the Emmanuel series, but it has Laura Gemser. So there's like the link, and
that's D'Amato.
That's Joe D'Amato. Yeah. Also a figure which perhaps is better known in the purely cold cinema sequel strands, but I think there's like some crossover there with like the Boro heads.
Yeah, Joe D'Amato is a future episode in waiting for sure.
I was also doing like a horror roundup, like what horror films or more like a psycho horror films I watched recently, and there's Harry Kumel's Malpertuis that reminds me a lot of Dr. Jekyll and Elle les Femmes. I think the register is different because it's more like a psychological aspects and it's more dark. It's darker, but the feeling, because it also takes place in one place in a house, and it's also around a family that is kind of gradually like destroying each other, and like they have this really fucked up relationship, and they as if the time stopped in that moment in that place and everything is going towards destruction, that kind of feeling. But the feeling through cinema is really potent in this film as well. And there's this bedridden Orson Welles in it. So if you're fans, yeah, like Orson Welles is in the bed, he never moves, but he's this great patriarch of the family. And if you want to see like a old Orson Welles acting without even moving any of his mimic, that Malpertuis is for you.
Those are the best kind of performances which someone gives sitting down late in their career.
How about you?
2 films really clearly come to mind from a screening that I went to 2 weeks ago. There was a community of filmmakers, including these 2 figures, James Robert Baker and Ken Camp, which was this queer Los Angeles, San Francisco community of gay men making films shot on video. And Ken Camp made a film in 1984 called Highway Hypnosis, which is one of the most strange and incoherent films I've ever seen. I mean, bordering on Emmanuel 5 level. Actually, I think much less coherent even than that. And this whole film basically just features Ken Camp driving on a highway to Nevada. And when I say the whole film, I mean it's almost all just shots of the road as he's driving, with needle drops of his favorite songs. So like David Bowie's Let's Dance, Jerry Rafferty, like you name it, interspersed with some graphic murders and gay sex, sometimes in the same scene. That film is like this real UFO that, like Emmanuel 5, only like rules by its own logic, that you have to either accept it completely as it is or reject it. And there was another film from the same screening from 1976, so 8 years before, by James Robert Baker, a member of this community, who's probably best known for directing the shot-on-video film Blonde Death, which I think a lot of people consider the best shot-on-video film. And this film is called Mouse Club Confidential. It's 16 minutes. And it's full, I mean, it's these guys living in San Francisco, loads of gay sex, and interspersed throughout very, very slanderous accusations against Disney. So coming back to Disney again, but you see the guys living in this apartment, claiming that Disneyland was founded by Nazis, wearing a Mickey Mouse hat where Mickey's ears are 2 swastikas while masturbating and fucking each other in the ass. And it's like, it's such a special film in some way. Highway Hypnosis is much less coherent and much more of a vibe-based film, whereas this is just like this amazing, almost violent, angry screed. So that's my recommendation for you.
Thank you for these recommendations, and all these films mentioned in the podcast and our recommendations, you can like look at them through show notes section. And if you guys also have like Borowczykian recommendations yourself, feel free to share with us. And if you also have comments and recommendations and advices or questions about what we talked about today, feel free to reach out to us through outskirtsfilmmagazine@gmail.com.